What comes to your mind when you think of the 1980s? Perhaps you think of President Reagan, or maybe you think of the Challenger spaceship, the fall of the Berlin Wall, some of the important events that happened then. Perhaps you're only informed by what you've seen on TV. Maybe you weren't even born during the 1980s, so it's just kind of history to you. Well, personally, for me, I was born early in 1980, so I grew up during the 1980s. And when I think of that through the lens of a little kid, I have fond memories of the things that happened in the 80s. It was certainly a different time, and we had a lot of fun. But as an adult, I can look back on the 80s and I can see how some of the things that happened there still affect us today. So specifically, we want to take a look at how the technology that became popular in the 1980s still affects us today. So to begin with, let's talk about computers. In 1984, a company called Apple released the Macintosh computer. And we're very familiar with Apple today. But the Macintosh was important because it was the first personal computer that had a graphic user interface. And what that means is that when you looked at the screen, you saw things, you had choices to make. It used to be you just typed in a command, all you had was text, but now you actually have visual representation of what the computer can do. And in 1985, Microsoft followed that up by releasing Microsoft Windows, the very first version of Microsoft Windows there. And we're so familiar with that today that if we say Windows, people automatically know what we're talking about. And in fact, 90% of computers today use Windows as their operating system. And then in 1989, Compaq released the first really viable notebook computer. There were some laptops before, but they were large and clunky. But the Compaq LTE was the first notebook-sized computer. And we're very familiar now with laptops. I even think about iPads or those sorts of devices are about the same size as a notebook. We're used to having that portability, taking it with us. And even our phones have computing power that is comparable or better than some of those early desktop and laptop computers. Well, what else came out of the 80s? Well, something that was very fun for me was video games. I remember very fondly when I was just 5 years old that I was fortunate enough that my grandparents bought my brother and sister and I a Nintendo Entertainment System. That's the original 8-bit, 2-button controller video game system, and we had a lot of fun with that. In fact, I still, from time to time, will get out the Nintendo, I still have it, hook it up and play some of those old games. And in fact, there were 62 million of those devices that were sold. And then in 1989, they followed it up with another hit, the Nintendo Game Boy. Now this was just a small handheld device that you could take with you. It had a little screen built right into it. And I remember riding the bus. If somebody happened to have snuck their Game Boy on, we were all hovered around. We all wanted to take our turn to get our chance to play Tetris or whatever game that they had. And in fact, we weren't alone because there were 119 million Game Boys that were sold. And where do we see the echoes of that today? Well, probably most of us, if not all of us on our phone, have some game installed that when we need to pass the time, we get our phone out and we play our little game. Well, that really started back in the 80s with the Game Boy, that portable gaming device. Now, speaking of portable devices, we can also look at some of the audio that came out at the time. Perhaps you're familiar with the Sony Walkman or the Sony Discman, which just came out just shortly after the Walkman. These allowed for the first time for people to just put their headphones on their ears and carry their music right along with them. And the Walkman used a cassette tape, and it wasn't long before, for the first time ever, more people were buying cassette tapes than they were records. There were studies that showed there was an uptick in walking as recreation and as exercise, and they attribute some of that to the Walkman as well as the Discman. Now the Discman was just different in that it actually could play a CD. And again, we had a lot of fun with those. I remember when we would go on trips beforehand, my brother and sister and I, we would make tapes of our favorite songs, and we could just put our headphones in so we weren't bothering our parents, and we could listen to our music during the whole drive. Now, what echo do we see of that today? Well, if you're like me, you have music, again, downloaded on your phone. You have your earbuds or your headphones that you stick in, and you're able to listen and really enjoy that. So the 1980s were a very interesting, fun decade to live in, to grow up in, and we still feel the effects today of the technology that came from the 1980s.